The deafening blast of a shotgun ripped through the quiet dawn of Marysvale, Utah, sending a flock of startled birds into the pale October sky as Abigail James clutched the termination letter in her trembling hands, the words moral indecency burning into her vision as surely as the life growing inside her womb. Marysvale, Utah 1878. Miss James, I expect you to vacate the premises by sundown, said Henry Blackwell, owner of the Marysvale General Store, his voice cutting through the stillness of the early morning. His wife Edith stood beside him, her thin lips pressed into a hard line of judgment. Your condition is not something I can have associated with my business. Abigail James stood perfectly still, her honey-brown hair pulled back in a simple bun, her gray dress unable to conceal the slight swell of her stomach at 4 months with child. At 22, she had never imagined finding herself in such a position, unmarried, pregnant, and now unemployed. Mr. Blackwell, please, she began, her voice barely above a whisper. I've worked for you for 3 years without incident. Without incident. Edith Blackwell interjected, her voice shrill. You call carrying a bastard child without incident. The women of this town won't set foot in our store with you behind the counter. It's indecent. Abigail flinched as though she'd been slapped. I have nowhere to go. Henry Blackwell's expression remained unmoved. That should have been a consideration before you strayed from the path of righteousness, Miss James. Your wages through yesterday. He placed a small envelope on the counter between them. Now, I must insist you leave before customers arrive. With as much dignity as she could muster, Abigail took the envelope, her fingers closing around the meager sum that represented all she had in the world. She didn't tell them that the child's father, a traveling salesman who had promised her the world during his 3 weeks in Marysvale, had disappeared weeks ago, leaving only empty promises and a child to remember him by. Walking out onto the dusty Main Street, Abigail felt the weight of stares from early risers already beginning their day. News traveled fast in Marysvale. By noon, everyone would know she'd been dismissed. You all right there, Miss Abigail? The voice made her turn. Samuel Zane sat atop his chestnut stallion, his broad shoulders silhouetted against the rising sun. At 28, he was one of the most respected ranchers in the territory, a man who had built his spread from nothing after arriving in Marysvale 6 years prior. I'm fine, Mr. Zane, she replied, quickly wiping away a tear that had escaped. Just on my way home. His eyes, a deep earth brown beneath the brim of his worn leather hat, studied her with concern. He dismounted in one fluid motion, boots stirring the dust as he approached her. Don't look fine to me, he said, his voice low enough that passing townsfolk couldn't hear. Heard Blackwell was making a fuss about something. That about you? Abigail looked down at her feet, shame washing over her. Samuel Zane had always been kind to her, stopping to chat whenever he came into town for supplies. Sometimes he'd bring her wildflowers he'd picked on the way, claiming they'd just caught his eye. But she couldn't bear to see the disappointment in his face when he learned of her disgrace. I've lost my position at the store, she admitted, still not meeting his gaze. And my room above it. Mr. Blackwell has asked me to leave town. Leave town? Samuel's voice hardened. On whose authority? It's his right. The room was part of my employment. Samuel stepped closer, and she could smell the leather and pine scent of him. And where will you go, Miss Abigail? She shook her head, finally looking up at him. I don't know. Perhaps to Salt Lake City. I might find work there. Alone. His gaze dropped momentarily to her midsection before returning to her face. There was no judgment in his eyes, only concern. Abigail's breath caught in her throat. You know. Small town, he said simply. Folks talk. Then you understand why Mr. Blackwell's a self-righteous fool, Samuel interrupted, his voice still quiet but edged with steel. "You need help, not condemnation." A wagon rumbled past, the driver tipping his hat to Samuel while pointedly avoiding Abigail's gaze. She felt the heat of shame creep up her neck. "I appreciate your kindness, Mr. Zane, but I can't accept charity. I'll find my way." Samuel glanced down the street, then back at her. "It's not charity I'm offering, Miss Abigail. It's a proposal. I don't understand." "My ranch needs a housekeeper. The place is a disaster since Mrs. Peterson left to care for her daughter in Provo. I can offer you room, board, and fair wages." He paused, his expression serious. "And a name for your child if you'll have it." Abigail stared at him, certain she'd misheard. "Mr. Zane, you can't possibly." "I can and I am," he said firmly. "I've known you 3 years, Abigail James. You're hardworking, honest, and kind. Whatever circumstances led to your current situation, they don't change who you are." She shook her head, bewildered by his offer. "The town will talk. They'll say horrible things about you." A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Let them. I've never much cared for town gossip. But why would you do this? Take responsibility for another man's child." Samuel's expression grew solemn. "Because every child deserves a father, and every good woman deserves respect, not scorn." He extended his hand. "Come to the ranch, Miss Abigail, at least until you decide what you want to do. No strings attached." Abigail looked at his offered hand, then back to his face. There was no deceit there, no ulterior motive she could discern. Only kindness and something else, something that made her heart beat a little faster. "I need to gather my things," she said finally. Samuel nodded. "I'll wait right here, then escort you to the ranch myself." As Abigail turned to head back to the store for her meager possessions, she felt something she hadn't expected. Hope. It blossomed in her chest like a desert flower after rain. An hour later, with her trunk loaded onto Samuel's wagon and the whispers of townsfolk following them down the main street, Abigail left Marysvale behind. Samuel handled the reins with confident hands, his profile strong against the vast Utah sky. "It's about 10 miles to my place," he told her. "Not too far, but far enough from prying eyes." "I still don't understand why you're doing this," Abigail said, watching the town recede behind them. Samuel was quiet for a moment. "My mother found herself in a similar situation when she was carrying me," he finally said. "My father was killed in a mining accident before they could marry. The town she lived in turned their backs on her. She died giving birth to me, alone except for a midwife who took pity on her." His hands tightened on the reins. "I was raised by that midwife until I was old enough to make my own way. I swore I'd never stand by and watch history repeat itself if I could help it." Abigail absorbed his words, understanding dawning. "I'm sorry about your mother." "It was a long time ago," he said, though his voice suggested the wound was still fresh. "The point is, Miss Abigail, you're not alone. Not anymore." They traveled in companionable silence after that, the rhythmic clop of the horses' hooves and the creak of the wagon wheels the only sounds. The landscape opened up around them, rolling hills dotted with sagebrush and juniper, the distant mountains a jagged line against the blue sky. When they crested a hill about 2 hours later, Samuel brought the wagon to a stop. "There it is," he said, pointing ahead. "Zane Ranch." Below them, nestled in a verdant valley cut by a winding creek, sat the ranch. It wasn't the largest spread in the territory, but it was impressive nonetheless, a sturdy 2-story main house painted white with green trim, several outbuildings, a large barn, and corrals where horses grazed peacefully. Beyond, cattle dotted the hillsides. "It's beautiful," Abigail breathed. "It's home," Samuel said simply and flicked the reins to continue their journey. As they approached the main house, Two men emerged from the barn, one older with a weathered face and silver hair, the other younger with a shock of red hair beneath his hat. "That's Caleb Turner, my foreman," Samuel explained, indicating the older man. "And the young one is Jimmy Walsh, one of my hands. There are three others, Tom, Charlie, and Miguel, but they're out with the herd today." The men watched curiously as Samuel helped Abigail down from the wagon, his strong hands at her waist momentarily before setting her gently on the ground. "Caleb, Jimmy," Samuel called, "come meet Miss Abigail James. She'll be taking over as housekeeper and will be staying with us for the foreseeable future." The men approached, removing their hats respectfully. "Madam," Caleb said with a nod, "welcome to Zane Ranch." "Thank you," Abigail replied, suddenly self-conscious under their scrutiny. "Miss James is expecting," Samuel said forthrightly, his voice matter of fact. "The child will be born here and will carry my name." Abigail's head whipped around to stare at him, but Samuel's expression remained calm, as if he'd just announced the weather. Caleb's eyebrows rose slightly, but he only nodded. "Understood, boss. We'll make sure everything's ready when the time comes." Jimmy looked between them, clearly curious but knowing better than to ask questions. "Need help with the lady's trunk, Mr. Zane?" "That'd be appreciated, Jimmy. Take it up to the blue room if you would." As Jimmy hefted her trunk from the wagon, Samuel placed a gentle hand at the small of Abigail's back. "Let me show you the house." The main house was larger than it had appeared from a distance, a sprawling ranch house with a wide porch wrapping around two sides. Inside, it was well built but clearly in need of a woman's touch. The furnishings were solid but sparse, the walls bare except for a few landscape paintings and a gun rack. "It's not much to look at," Samuel admitted as he led her through the parlor, "but it's sturdy and warm in winter." "It's wonderful," Abigail said honestly. After her tiny room above the store, the house seemed palatial. Samuel showed her the kitchen with its large wood-burning stove, the dining room with a table big enough to seat 10, a study lined with bookshelves, and upstairs, the bedrooms including the blue room that would be hers. It was spacious, with a 4-poster bed, a dresser, and a washstand. Crisp white curtains framed windows that looked out over the valley. "My room is at the end of the hall," Samuel explained. "The men stay in the bunkhouse by the barn, except for Caleb, who has the small cabin near the creek. You'll have privacy here." Abigail ran her hand over the quilt on the bed, overwhelmed by his generosity. "Mr. Zane, Samuel, please. If we're to convince folks you're my wife, you should use my given name." She looked up sharply. "Your wife?" He leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed over his broad chest. "It's the only way to protect your reputation and the child's. We'll tell everyone we married in secret a few months back. It's not uncommon for ranchers to take wives from other towns." "But we haven't, we're not," Abigail stammered, her cheeks flushing. "It would be in name only," Samuel assured her quickly. "I'm a man of my word, Abigail. I won't expect anything from you. You'll have your own room always. I'm offering protection, nothing more." Abigail studied him, trying to understand his motivation. "And when the child is born?" "Everyone will believe it's yours. That's the idea. No child should bear the stigma of being born without a father." His expression softened. "I know what that's like. You would do that, claim another man's child as your own." Samuel straightened, his eyes never leaving hers. "I would. And I'll raise that child as my own with all the love and care any father would give, if you'll let me." Abigail's eyes filled with tears. "Why me, Samuel? You could have any woman in the territory. Why tie yourself to someone like me?" Something flickered in his eyes, a warmth that made her breath catch. "Maybe I've had my eye on a certain store clerk for longer than she realizes. Maybe I've been working up the courage to court her proper for some time now. But now you're still the same Abigail James who always has a kind word for everyone who enters that store. The same woman who helped old Mrs. Finch home in the snowstorm last winter. The same woman I've admired from afar for too long. He stepped forward, taking her hand in his much larger one. I'm not saying I expect you to have feelings for me, Abigail, but I'm offering you and your child a home in my name. The rest can come in time or not at all. That will be up to you. Abigail looked down at their joined hands, his sun browned against her pale skin. It was more than she could have hoped for, more than she deserved, perhaps. I accept, she said softly. And thank you, Samuel. His smile transformed his face, making him look younger, almost boyish. Good. Then welcome home, Mrs. Zane. The following weeks passed in a blur as Abigail settled into life at Zane Ranch. The work was hard but satisfying, cooking for Samuel and his men, cleaning the house, tending to the vegetable garden behind the kitchen. Her pregnancy progressed, her belly growing more pronounced, but instead of shame, she now felt a tentative joy when she felt the baby move. Samuel proved to be a considerate employer and an even more considerate pretend husband. He insisted she rest frequently, brought her wildflowers from the range, and began building a cradle in the evenings by the firelight, his strong hands shaping the wood with surprising gentleness. One evening in late November, Abigail was preparing supper when she heard horses in the yard. Looking out the kitchen window, she saw Samuel dismounting alongside a man she recognized as Pastor Williams from the Marysvale Church. Quickly wiping her hands on her apron, she went to the door to greet them. Abigail, Samuel called, his smile warm as he led the pastor toward the house. Look who I ran into in town today. Pastor Williams removed his hat as he approached, his expression uncertain. Mrs. Zane, he said, testing the name. Pastor Williams, she replied, trying to hide her nervousness. What a surprise. Will you stay for supper? I've made plenty. The pastor has some concerns he wanted to discuss, Samuel said, his hand coming to rest protectively at the small of her back as they entered the house. Once seated in the parlor, Pastor Williams cleared his throat. I must admit, I was shocked to hear of your hasty marriage. And now to find you in this condition, Mrs. Zane. The timing raises questions. Abigail's hands twisted in her lap. I understand your concern, Pastor. What my wife means, Samuel interjected smoothly, is that we understand how our private marriage might seem unusual. But I assure you we were properly wed before she conceived. Pastor Williams' eyes narrowed slightly. Then why the secrecy? Why not announce your marriage to the town? Samuel leaned forward, his expression earnest. That's my fault, Pastor. I've always been a private man. Abigail wanted a church wedding, but I insisted on something quiet, just the two of us and a justice of the peace in Cedar City when I was there on business. I didn't realize how it would look when her condition became known. He reached for Abigail's hand. I've caused my wife undue suffering because of my stubbornness, and for that, I'm deeply sorry. Abigail stared at him, marveling at how easily the lies fell from his lips, lies told to protect her. I see, Pastor Williams said, though he didn't sound entirely convinced. And the marriage certificate, lost in a creek crossing on our way back, Samuel replied without hesitation. But we can provide witnesses who saw us together in Cedar City, if necessary. The pastor studied them both for a long moment. That won't be necessary, Mr. Zane. Your word has always been good in this community. He turned to Abigail. Mrs. Zane, I owe you an apology for the town's treatment of you. Had we known, it's in the past, she said softly. All I want now is to look forward to the birth of our child and our life here. Pastor Williams nodded, his demeanor warming. Then perhaps you'll allow me to announce your marriage properly this Sunday. Clear the air once and for all." Samuel squeezed her hand. "We'd be honored, Pastor." After the pastor left, having stayed for supper after all, Abigail found herself alone with Samuel on the porch. The night was crisp, stars scattered across the black velvet of the sky. "You didn't have to do that," she said quietly. "Lie to a man of God for me." Samuel leaned against the porch railing, his profile strong in the moonlight. "I didn't lie about the important parts. I do want to give you and your child a good life here. But we're not truly married, Samuel." He turned to face her, his expression serious. "We could be, for real." Abigail's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" "I mean I could ride into Cedar City tomorrow, bring back a real justice of the peace. Make an honest woman of you in truth, not just in the town's eyes." "Samuel, you don't have to do that. You've already done more than enough." He stepped closer, and in the moonlight, his eyes were dark and intent. "What if I want to, Abigail? What if I've wanted to since the first time you smiled at me over that store counter 3 years ago?" She shook her head, confusion and something else, something warm and hopeful blooming in her chest. "You can't mean that. I'm carrying another man's child." "A child I already love," he said simply, "because it's a part of you." Tears sprang to Abigail's eyes. "How can you be so sure?" "You barely know me. I know enough." He reached out, gently brushing a tear from her cheek. "I know you're kind and strong. I know you face life's hardships with grace. I know that when you smile, it lights up something inside me I thought died years ago." He took her hands in his. "I'm not asking you to love me now, Abigail. I'm asking for a chance to earn your love day by day." Abigail looked up at this man, this good, honorable man who had rescued her from disgrace and offered her a future she never thought possible. In the weeks she'd been at the ranch, she'd seen his gentleness with the animals, his fairness with his men, his quiet strength that never turned to cruelty. And yes, she'd felt something stirring in her heart when he smiled at her across the dinner table or worked beside her in the garden. "Yes," she whispered, surprising herself with the certainty she felt. "Yes, Samuel, I'll marry you, for real." His smile was like the dawn breaking. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, he leaned down and pressed his lips to hers in a gentle, chaste kiss that nevertheless sent warmth flooding through her. When he pulled back, his eyes were filled with promise. "We'll make a good life, Abigail. You, me, and our child. Our child." The words filled her with a joy she never expected to feel. 2 days later, a justice of the peace from Cedar City stood in their parlor as Samuel and Abigail exchanged vows, real vows this time with Caleb, and the ranch hands as witnesses. Abigail wore her best dress, altered to accommodate her growing belly, and Samuel had trimmed his beard and donned a new shirt for the occasion. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the justice declared. "Mr. Zane, you may kiss your bride." This kiss was different from their first, deeper, filled with promise and a tenderness that made Abigail's knees weak. When they parted, the men cheered and stomped their boots, and for the first time in months, Abigail felt truly at peace. That night, after a celebratory dinner prepared by Caleb, who insisted the new bride shouldn't cook on her wedding day, Samuel walked Abigail to her bedroom door. "I meant what I said before," he told her quietly. "This marriage will progress at your pace, Abigail. I won't rush you." She looked up at him, this man who was now her husband in truth. "Thank you," she whispered, standing on tiptoe to kiss his cheek. "Good night, husband." His smile was tender. "Good night, wife." As December arrived, bringing with it the first snows of winter, Abigail found herself settling comfortably into her role as mistress of Zane Ranch. The house was transformed under her care. Curtains hung in windows that had been bare. Shelves that had collected dust now displayed treasured books and small keepsakes. and the smell of home-cooked meals and fresh bread replaced the bachelor staleness that had permeated the rooms. More importantly, she found herself falling steadily, irrevocably in love with her husband. Samuel was everything she could have hoped for, attentive without being overbearing, respectful of her independence while always ready to offer support. Each night, he escorted her to her bedroom door with a gentle kiss, never pushing for more, though the heat in his eyes told her he wanted to. One evening in mid-December, Abigail was sitting by the fire in the parlor, sewing baby clothes when Samuel entered, his arms full of packages. "What's all this?" she asked, setting aside her sewing. "Christmas is coming," he replied with a boyish grin. "Thought I'd get some decorations from town. Never bothered much before, but this year seems different." Together, they hung pine boughs over the mantel and doorways, strung cranberries and popcorn for the small pine tree Samuel had cut from the north ridge, and placed candles in the windows. When they finished, the house glowed with warmth and festivity. "It's beautiful," Abigail said, gazing around at their handiwork. "You're beautiful," Samuel replied, his eyes on her. She blushed, still unused to such direct compliments. At nearly 6 months pregnant, she felt anything but beautiful, her body changing daily, her movements becoming more awkward. But when Samuel looked at her like that, she could almost believe it. "I have something else," he said, reaching into his pocket. He pulled out a small velvet box. "I should have given you this at our wedding, but it wasn't ready yet." Abigail took the box with trembling fingers. Inside was a delicate gold ring set with a small, perfect sapphire. "Samuel," she breathed, "it's exquisite." "It was my mother's," he said quietly. "The only thing I have of hers. The midwife who raised me saved it for when I found the right woman to give it to." Tears filled Abigail's eyes as he took the ring and slipped it onto her finger. "I don't deserve this. You deserve this and so much more." He cupped her face in his hands. "I love you, Abigail. I know it's soon, and I don't expect you to return the feeling yet, but I needed you to know." The words she'd been holding in her heart for weeks now rose to her lips. "I love you too, Samuel. I think I've been falling in love with you since the day you brought me here." The joy that transformed his face was like sunshine breaking through clouds. Slowly, reverently, he bent to kiss her, a kiss that deepened as she wound her arms around his neck. When they finally parted, breathless, he rested his forehead against hers. "I've been wanting to do that properly for weeks now." She smiled up at him. "What took you so long?" His answering smile was tender. "I needed to be sure you were ready, that your heart was truly in this marriage." "It is," she assured him. "Completely." That night, for the first time, Abigail invited Samuel into her room, into her bed. Their lovemaking was gentle, mindful of her condition, but no less passionate for it. Afterward, as they lay tangled in the sheets, her head on his chest, Abigail marveled at how fate had brought her to this moment. The disgrace that had seemed like the end of her life had instead led her to a new beginning. "What are you thinking about?" Samuel murmured, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on her bare shoulder. "How sometimes the worst thing that happens to you leads to the best thing," she replied honestly. He pressed a kiss to her forehead. "For me, the best thing was finding you, Abigail Zane." The weeks passed in domestic bliss as winter settled over the valley. The ranch was quiet in the cold months, with only essential work to be done, feeding cattle, breaking ice on water troughs, keeping the buildings in repair. Samuel spent more time at home, often working alongside Abigail in domestic tasks or reading to her in the evenings as she sewed baby clothes. They had converted the small room adjacent to their bedroom, for they now shared the master bedroom, into a nursery, with the cradle Samuel had crafted placed under the window. Abigail had sewn curtains and a quilt, and Samuel had brought home a rocking chair from town, a surprise that had moved her to tears. In late January, as Abigail entered her 8th month, a winter storm descended on the valley, bringing howling winds and swirling snow that piled in drifts against the house. By evening, the world outside the windows was a white blur. "Worst storm I've seen in years," Caleb commented as he joined them for supper, having trudged from his cabin through the deepening snow. "Might be snowed in for a couple days." Samuel nodded, his expression concerned as he glanced at Abigail. "We've got plenty of firewood and food. Should be fine." But as the night progressed, the storm intensified. The wind found every crack and crevice in the old house, creating an eerie whistling sound that made Abigail shiver despite the roaring fire. "Come to bed," Samuel urged her gently. "It's warmer upstairs." They retired early, nestled together under a mound of quilts, listening to the storm rage outside. Samuel's arm was draped protectively over her rounded belly, his body curled around hers, keeping her safe and warm. In the darkest hours of the night, Abigail woke with a gasp of pain. "Samuel," she whispered urgently, clutching her stomach. He was instantly awake. "What is it? The baby?" "Something's wrong," she managed as another wave of pain washed over her. "It's too soon." Samuel was out of bed in an instant, lighting the lamp and helping her sit up. "I'll get Caleb, have him ride for the doctor." The storm, Caleb knows the way blindfolded. He pressed a kiss to her forehead. "Hold on, love, help is coming." But when Samuel returned with Caleb 20 minutes later, his expression was grim. "The drifts are too high. No horse could make it through to town tonight." Abigail clutched the bedsheets as another contraction seized her. "The baby's coming, Samuel. I can feel it." Caleb stepped forward, his weathered face set with determination. "My sister had 5 children. I helped with 3 of them when the doctor couldn't make it. I'm no midwife, but I know the basics." Samuel looked at him with relief and gratitude. "Tell me what to do." The next hours were a blur of pain and fear for Abigail. The contractions came faster and stronger as the night wore on. Samuel never left her side, holding her hand, wiping her brow with a cool cloth, murmuring words of encouragement. "You're the strongest woman I know," he told her as she gripped his hand through another contraction. "You can do this, Abigail." Caleb directed the proceedings with calm efficiency, sending Jimmy to boil water and fetch clean linens, positioning Abigail for delivery, checking her progress. "The baby's coming fast," he announced as dawn approached. "Next time you feel the need to push, go ahead." Abigail nodded, exhausted but determined. When the next contraction hit, she bore down with all her might, Samuel supporting her shoulders. "I can see the head," Caleb exclaimed. "One more big push, Mrs. Zane." Gathering her last reserves of strength, Abigail pushed, a cry tearing from her throat, and then suddenly, a new cry filled the room. The thin, outraged wail of a newborn. "It's a boy," Caleb announced, his voice thick with emotion as he wrapped the squirming infant in a clean towel. "A healthy baby boy." He placed the child in Abigail's arms, and through her tears, she saw her son for the first time, red-faced, dark-haired, perfect in every way. "Samuel," she whispered, "look at him." Samuel knelt beside the bed, one arm around her shoulders, his other hand gently touching the baby's cheek. "He's beautiful," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "Just like his mother." Caleb quietly left the room, giving the new family privacy in this sacred moment. "He's early but strong," Abigail said, watching in wonder as tiny fingers wrapped around Samuel's much larger one. "Just like his mother," Samuel repeated, pressing a kiss to her temple. "What shall we name him?" Abigail looked up at the man who had saved her, who had given her and her child a home and a name when the rest of the world had turned its back. The man she now loved with all her heart. "Matthew," she said softly. Matthew Samuel Zane. Samuel's eyes filled with tears. Matthew, he agreed. Our son. And in that moment, it was true. The child may not have been born of Samuel's blood, but he was born of Samuel's heart. The love in his eyes as he gazed at the infant was as real as any biological father's could be. Outside, the storm had passed, leaving the world transformed pure white and sparkling in the new morning sun. Inside, another transformation had taken place. They were no longer a man and woman brought together by circumstance, but a family, bound by love. Spring came to the valley, turning the hills green and filling the air with the scent of wildflowers. Matthew thrived, growing stronger each day, his dark eyes so like Samuel's, by some quirk of fate taking in the world with curiosity. Word had spread throughout Marysvale and the surrounding area about the premature birth of the Zane's son during the winter storm. If anyone questioned the timing, they kept it to themselves. The story of how Samuel Zane had assisted in his son's delivery, with only his foreman to help, had transformed into a tale of heroism that enhanced rather than diminished his standing in the community. On a warm May morning, Samuel found Abigail in the garden behind the house, Matthew sleeping peacefully in a basket in the shade of an apple tree. "I've been thinking," Samuel said, wrapping his arms around her waist from behind and resting his chin on her shoulder. "A dangerous pastime," she teased, leaning back against his solid strength. He chuckled, the sound rumbling against her back. "I'm serious. I've been thinking we should make Matthew's position official." Abigail turned in his arms, looking up at him quizzically. "What do you mean?" "He's already legally a Zane by virtue of our marriage." "Yes, but I want to adopt him formally. I want there to never be any question that he's my son in every way that matters." Samuel's expression was earnest. "I want to be able to tell him when he's old enough to understand that I chose him. That being his father was a deliberate decision I made out of love, not obligation." Tears sprang to Abigail's eyes. "You're already the only father he's ever known, the only father he'll ever need." "I know," Samuel said, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "But I want it documented, official, for his sake and for mine." Abigail stood on tiptoe to kiss him, her heart full to bursting with love for this man. "Then we'll do it, together." The following Sunday they took Matthew to church in Marysvale for the first time. The same townspeople who had once whispered behind Abigail's back now cooed over the baby, admiring his dark curls and Samuel's eyes. After the service, Pastor Williams blessed the child, officially welcoming Matthew Samuel Zane into the congregation. As they stood before the altar, Samuel's arm around Abigail's waist, their son cradled against her heart, Abigail couldn't help but marvel at how far they had come. "Mrs. Zane," a familiar voice said as they exited the church. Abigail turned to see Henry and Edith Blackwell, the very people who had cast her out just months before. "Mr. and Mrs. Blackwell," she acknowledged, her voice steady. Samuel's hand tightened supportively at her waist. Edith Blackwell's eyes were fixed on Matthew, her expression softening. "He's a handsome boy, takes after his father." "Yes, he does," Abigail agreed, exchanging a private smile with Samuel. Henry Blackwell cleared his throat awkwardly. "We find ourselves in need of help at the store again. If you ever decide you'd like to return to work, my wife has her hands full with our son and managing the ranch house," Samuel interjected smoothly. "But thank you for the offer." "Of course," Henry mumbled, his face flushing. "Just thought we'd ask." As the Blackwells walked away, Abigail leaned into Samuel's side. "That felt good," she admitted. "Being recognized as the capable, respectable woman you are," Samuel asked, pressing a kiss to her temple. "That and knowing I don't need their approval anymore. I have everything I need right here." The summer days stretched long and golden as life on the ranch settled into a comfortable rhythm. Matthew grew stronger each day, sitting up on his own by July, crawling by August, his personality emerging stubborn like his mother, curious like his father. In September, just after Matthew's 8-month birthday, Samuel and Abigail hosted a harvest celebration at the ranch. The entire community was invited, a gesture that cemented their position as one of the prominent families in the area. Tables were set up in the yard, groaning with food. Fiddle music filled the air as children played games and adults caught up on gossip. Matthew was passed from arm to arm, admired and cooed over by all. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the valley, Samuel found Abigail standing alone on the porch, watching the celebrations. "Happy?" he asked, coming to stand beside her. "More than I ever thought possible," she replied honestly, leaning into him as his arm came around her shoulders. "I have something for you," he said, reaching into his pocket. He pulled out a small wooden box hand-carved with intricate flower designs. "Open it." Inside, nestled on a bed of velvet, lay a gold locket on a delicate chain. When Abigail opened it, she found a tiny portrait of Matthew on one side and Samuel on the other. "It's beautiful," she whispered as he fastened it around her neck. "I wanted you to always have your family close to your heart," he said, "even when I'm out on the range." Abigail turned to face him, framing his beloved face in her hands. "You are the best man I've ever known, Samuel Zane." "Do you know that?" he smiled, the creases around his eyes deepening. "I'm just a man who recognized a treasure when he found one." As dusk fell, the guests gathered in the yard for a final dance before heading home. Samuel led Abigail to the center of the makeshift dance floor, one hand at her waist, the other holding hers. As they moved to the sweet, melancholy tune of the fiddle, Abigail felt a perfect contentment wash over her. A year ago, she had been alone, disgraced, with nowhere to turn. Now she stood in the circle of her husband's arms, their son asleep in a cradle nearby, surrounded by a community that respected them, on land that was their home. "What are you thinking?" Samuel murmured, his lips close to her ear. "I'm thinking about that day in town when you found me outside the store with nowhere to go. How different my life would be if you hadn't stopped." "I would have found a way to help you," he said with certainty. "Even then, I couldn't bear the thought of you suffering." "You saved me," she said simply. Samuel shook his head. "No, Abigail, you saved me. I was existing, not living, before you came into my life. You gave me purpose, a family, love." He pulled her closer. "You gave me everything." As the music swelled around them, Samuel bent to kiss her, a kiss filled with promise and tenderness and passion. And Abigail knew, with bone-deep certainty, that this was where she belonged. Not just in Marysvale or on Zane Ranch, but here, in this man's arms, with their son nearby and their future stretching out before them like the vast Utah sky. By the following spring, as Matthew took his first tentative steps across the parlor floor, Abigail discovered she was expecting again. The news filled both her and Samuel with joy, though she couldn't help but feel a twinge of anxiety this time. The child would be Samuel's by blood as well as by love. "Does it worry you?" she asked one night as they lay in bed, his hand splayed protectively over her still flat stomach. "That you might love this child differently than Matthew?" Samuel propped himself up on one elbow, looking down at her with surprise. "Why would I? Because this baby is truly yours. Matthew is truly mine," he said firmly. "The moment I held him, the moment he wrapped his little hand around my finger, he became my son in every way that matters." His expression softened. "This new little one will be just as loved, no more and no less. They'll both be Zane's, equal in our hearts and in our home." And Abigail believed him, because Samuel Zane had never given her reason to doubt his word. The pregnancy progressed smoothly through the summer and fall. Matthew, now a sturdy toddler with Samuel's smile and determined spirit, seemed to understand something special was happening. He would pat Abigail's growing belly gently, saying "baby" in his clear little voice. On a crisp December evening, with snow falling gently outside, Abigail gave birth to a daughter, Elizabeth Rose Zane, named for both their mothers. The delivery was easier this time, with a proper midwife in attendance, Samuel by her side throughout. When Samuel held his daughter for the first time, the look of wonder on his face was identical to the one he'd worn when he first held Matthew. In that moment, Abigail knew without a doubt that both children would be loved equally, completely. Matthew, allowed into the room to meet his sister the following morning, approached the bed cautiously. Samuel lifted him up to see the bundle in Abigail's arms. "Baby?" Matthew asked, his dark eyes wide. "Yes, sweetheart. This is your sister, Elizabeth." Matthew studied the tiny face for a long moment, then leaned forward to place a gentle kiss on the baby's forehead, just as he'd seen his father do. "My sister," he declared with the certainty only a toddler could muster. Samuel's eyes met Abigail's over their children's heads, and the love she saw there took her breath away. This was their family, not perfect, perhaps, not conventional, but built on a foundation of love and choice rather than obligation or blood. As Elizabeth grew from infant to baby to toddler, following her brother's footsteps with equal determination, the story of their unconventional beginning faded into the background. To the people of Marysvale and the surrounding territory, they were simply the Zane family. Samuel, Abigail, Matthew, and Elizabeth, respected ranchers, good neighbors, a family bound by love. On Matthew's 5th birthday, after the cake had been eaten and the presents opened, after the few invited children had gone home and Elizabeth had been put to bed, Samuel took his son for a walk. They ended up by the creek that ran through the property, sitting on a log to watch the sunset. "You know I love you, right, son?" Samuel asked, his arm around the boy's narrow shoulders. Matthew nodded, secure in the knowledge that was as constant as the rising sun. "I love you too, Papa. And you know that you are my son in every way that matters." Another nod, though this time with a curious glance. "Course I am. You're my papa." Samuel took a deep breath. "There's something I want to tell you, something important. You might not understand all of it now, but someday you will." He looked down at the boy who had his eyes, by some strange coincidence of fate. "Before you were born, before I married your mother, she was in a difficult situation. She needed help, and I was lucky enough to be the one who could provide it." Matthew listened intently, his young face serious. "Most fathers don't get to choose their children," Samuel continued carefully. "They just get the ones God sends them. But I got to choose you, Matthew. I chose to be your father before you were even born, and it was the best decision I ever made. You chose me." Matthew repeated, trying to understand. "I did. I chose you and your mother, and then God blessed us further with your sister." Samuel tightened his arm around his son. "Some people might tell you someday that you're not really my son, but they're wrong. You are my son in every way that matters, in my heart, in our family, and in the eyes of the law." "But not in my blood?" Matthew asked, surprising Samuel with his perception. "Not in blood, no, but blood is the least important part of being a family. Love is what matters. Choosing each other every day, that's what makes a family." Matthew was quiet for a moment, processing this information in his 5-year-old way. Then he looked up at Samuel with those familiar dark eyes. "I choose you too, Papa." Samuel's throat tightened with emotion as he pulled his son into a fierce hug. This boy, This amazing child who had come into his life through such unlikely circumstances had taught him more about love than he'd ever thought possible. Later that night, after Matthew was asleep, Samuel recounted the conversation to Abigail as they sat by the fire. "You told him?" she asked, surprised. "I thought we agreed to wait until he was older." "It felt right," Samuel explained. "And I wanted him to hear it from me first, in a way that emphasized how wanted he is, how chosen, not as some shameful secret." Abigail considered this, then nodded slowly. "You're right. And how did he take it?" "Like he takes everything with that serious little face, thinking it through." "Then he told me he chooses me too." Samuel's voice broke slightly on the last words. Abigail moved to sit beside him on the sofa, taking his hand in hers. "We've built something beautiful here, haven't we?" Samuel looked around their home at the evidence of children scattered about, the family portraits on the walls, the warmth and love that filled every corner, then back at his wife's beloved face. "More beautiful than I ever dreamed possible," he agreed, pulling her close. As the years passed, the Zane Ranch prospered and grew. Samuel's careful management and forward-thinking approaches to ranching paid off, allowing them to acquire additional land and expand their herds. Abigail, with her keen mind for figures, kept the books and helped make business decisions that proved profitable time and again. Their family grew as well. When Matthew was 7 and Elizabeth 3, twins joined the family, James and Thomas, named for Samuel's father and brother. The house rang with children's laughter and occasional squabbles, with lessons and stories and the everyday joys of family life. Matthew grew into his role as eldest with a natural leadership that reminded everyone of Samuel. By 10, he was helping with ranch chores, learning the business from his father with a seriousness that sometimes made the adults hide smiles. Elizabeth, with her mother's honey-brown hair and quick mind, became Samuel's shadow, insisting on riding with him whenever possible. The twins, identical in appearance but opposite in temperament, rounded out the family perfectly. James quiet and thoughtful, Thomas bold and adventurous. Through it all, the bond between Samuel and Abigail only strengthened. Their partnership in parenting, in running the ranch, in building a life together, was the foundation upon which everything else rested. The love that had begun in such unusual circumstances had deepened into something profound and unshakable. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Samuel surprised Abigail with a trip to San Francisco, their first significant time away from the ranch and children. Caleb, now a trusted family friend as much as an employee, promised to keep everything running smoothly in their absence. "Are you sure about this?" Abigail asked as they boarded the train, her hand tucked into the crook of Samuel's arm. 2 weeks is a long time to be away. The children will be fine with Caleb and Mrs. Peterson looking after them, Samuel assured her. "And you deserve to see something beyond Utah territory, my love." San Francisco dazzled them both with its sophistication and energy. They stayed in a grand hotel, dined in elegant restaurants, attended the theater, and walked along the waterfront hand in hand like newlyweds. For Abigail, who had never traveled beyond Utah, it was a revelation. "It's magnificent," she said as they stood on a hill overlooking the bay, the city spread out below them. "But do you know what?" "What?" Samuel asked, his arm around her waist. "As beautiful as it is, I miss our home. Our children, our life." Samuel smiled, pressing a kiss to her temple. "I was thinking the same thing. We've built something special, Abigail, something rare." "From such unlikely beginnings," she mused, thinking back to that October day when her world had seemed to end, only to lead her to a new beginning. On their last night in San Francisco, as they prepared for bed in their luxurious hotel suite, Samuel presented her with a velvet box. Another anniversary gift, Abigail asked, opening it to reveal a stunning pearl necklace with a diamond clasp. A reminder, Samuel said as he fastened it around her neck, his fingers brushing her skin. Pearls begin as an irritation, a grain of sand that doesn't belong. But the oyster transforms that irritation into something beautiful. He turned her to face him. Just as we transformed our difficult beginning into this beautiful life. Abigail's eyes filled with tears as she reached up to touch the pearls. I love you, Samuel Zane. More today than yesterday and less than tomorrow. And I love you, he replied, gathering her into his arms. My wife, my partner, the mother of my children, the heart of our home. That night, as they made love with the same passion that had marked their relationship from the beginning, Abigail felt a profound gratitude for the twists of fate that had brought her to this man. The disgrace that had once seemed like the end of her world had been merely the beginning of a journey she could never have imagined. When they returned home, the children rushed to greet them, full of stories and clamoring for attention. The house was somewhat messier than when they'd left, the routine slightly disrupted, but it was their home, filled with love and life and possibilities. That evening, after the children were in bed, Samuel and Abigail sat on the porch swing, watching the stars appear over their valley. Do you ever wonder, Abigail asked softly, what would have happened if you hadn't stopped to help me that day? Samuel considered the question. I like to think I would have found you anyway, that some things are meant to be, regardless of the path. I used to believe everything happened for a reason, she admitted. Then when I found myself alone and pregnant, I questioned that belief. But now, she looked up at him, at the beloved face that had been her anchor for a decade. Now I think perhaps I was right the first time. Everything did happen for a reason. It led me to you. Samuel pulled her closer, his arm secure around her shoulders. To us, he corrected gently. To this family, this life we've built together. As they sat in companionable silence, watching the night deepen over the land that was their legacy, Abigail reflected on the journey that had brought them here. From shame and desperation to love and fulfillment. From a frightened young woman with nowhere to turn to the mistress of a prosperous ranch, surrounded by children and a husband who adored her. The scandal that had once threatened to define her had been transformed into the foundation of a life more beautiful than she could have dreamed. And the man beside her, the cowboy who had taken her in when the world turned its back, who had claimed her child as his own without hesitation, had become the center of her world, the compass by which she navigated her life. What are you thinking about? Samuel asked, noticing her pensive expression. Abigail smiled, resting her head against his shoulder as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. I'm thinking that sometimes the end of one story is just the beginning of a better one. Samuel nodded, understanding perfectly as he always did. And our story, Mrs. Zane, what do you think of that one? Abigail looked up at him, at the man who had rescued her in every way a person could be rescued, and felt her heart overflow with love. I think, Mr. Zane, that our story is just getting to the good part. And as he bent to kiss her, the stars shining above the ranch they had built together, Abigail knew it was true. Their story born of desperation and kindness, nurtured by respect and passion, and grown into a love as vast as the Utah sky, was one that would stand the test of time. A legacy of love that would live on through their children and their children's children for generations to come. In the years that followed, that legacy only strengthened. Matthew, at 18, went to college in Denver, the first Zane to pursue higher education, returning with new ideas for expanding the ranch operations. Elizabeth, following in her mother's footsteps, became a teacher at the Marysvale School, bringing knowledge and compassion to a new generation. The twins found their own paths, James in law, Thomas in medicine, while always returning to the ranch that was the heart of their family. And through it all, Samuel and Abigail remained the center, the foundation upon which everything else was built. Their love, born in unlikely circumstances and tested by life's challenges, became a beacon for their children and grandchildren, a testament to the power of choosing love day after day, year after year. On their 30th anniversary, with their children, grandchildren, and the entire community gathered to celebrate, Samuel raised a toast to his wife. "To Abigail," he said, his voice strong despite the silver now threading his dark hair, his eyes still shining with the same love that had been there from the beginning. "The woman who taught me that family is built with love, not blood. The mother of my children in every way that matters. My partner, my heart, my home." And as their family and friends cheered, as Matthew, now a grown man with a family of his own, watched his parents with pride and understanding, Abigail knew that the story that had begun in shame and fear had transformed into something beautiful beyond measure. A story not of disgrace, but of redemption, not of abandonment, but of being found. A story of a cowboy who took in a desperate woman and her unborn child, claiming them both as his own, not out of duty or obligation, but out of a love that would echo through generations. Their story, their legacy, their love, and it had only just begun.